Let time break the avoidant. The longer they go without you, the more it hurts. There is a strange moment that happens after someone leaves your life, a moment nobody prepares you for. It is not the goodbye itself. It is not the last conversation. It is not even the silence that follows. It is the moment when you realize you are carrying all the pain while they seem completely fine. You replay memories while they appear unaffected. You struggle to sleep while they seem to be moving forward. You question every detail of the relationship while they look calm, detached, maybe even relieved. And if that person was avoidant, this contrast can feel especially brutal. Because nothing hurts quite like believing someone who mattered deeply to you has escaped the emotional consequences entirely. It creates a haunting question: did they ever really care? But what if the story is not unfolding the way it appears? What if the timeline of pain is different? What if the very silence that makes you believe they are unaffected is actually the beginning of a process they have not yet reached? In this video, we are going to explore one of the most misunderstood realities of avoidant psychology. Because when it comes to loss, avoidants often experience emotions on a completely different schedule than everyone else. And before we dive deeper, subscribe if you want to understand what is really happening beneath avoidant behavior, because the truth is often far more complicated than what appears on the surface. The first thing most people notice after an avoidant creates distance is the silence. Not just physical silence, but emotional silence. There are no dramatic confessions, no visible heartbreak, no obvious signs of regret. In many cases, the avoidant seems almost comfortable. Maybe they disappear into work, maybe they focus on hobbies, maybe they appear lighter than they did during the relationship. To the person left behind, this can feel devastating. It looks like proof that the connection meant far more to one person than the other. But what many people fail to understand is that the avoidant often experiences something very specific during the early stages of separation: relief. Not relief because the relationship was meaningless, not relief because they never cared, relief because the pressure is gone. The emotional intensity that activated their fears has suddenly disappeared. The expectations, the vulnerability, the closeness, the possibility of emotional dependence, all of it feels temporarily distant. For an avoidant nervous system, that distance can create a sensation that resembles freedom, and because this relief appears so quickly, it is often mistaken for indifference. Even the avoidant may misunderstand what is happening. They may genuinely believe they are moving on smoothly because what they are feeling in that moment is not loss, it is the absence of emotional pressure. But the absence of pressure is not the same thing as the absence of attachment. Those are two very different experiences, and confusing them is where many misunderstandings begin. What makes avoidant psychology so difficult to understand is that their emotional processing often operates with a delay. Most people experience an emotional event and feel the impact relatively quickly. The pain arrives and then they begin working through it. Avoidants often move in the opposite direction. They create distance first, experience relief second, and only later begin encountering the emotions they thought they had escaped. This delay is one of the defining characteristics of avoidant attachment. Throughout life, many avoidants learn to suppress emotional experiences that feel overwhelming. They become skilled at compartmentalizing. They distract themselves. They focus on practical concerns. They redirect attention away from uncomfortable feelings. These strategies can be incredibly effective in the short term. So effective, in fact, that the avoidant may genuinely believe they are unaffected. But emotions do not disappear simply because they are ignored. They wait, they settle beneath the surface, and eventually they begin demanding attention. This is why an avoidant may appear emotionally untouched immediately after separation while struggling months later with feelings they never expected to face. The emotional reality arrives long after everyone assumes the story is over. By the time the avoidant begins fully processing the loss, the person who originally suffered may already be halfway through healing. It is a reversal that surprises many people because it contradicts everything they thought they knew about grief and attachment. As time continues passing, something subtle begins changing. The distance that once felt comforting starts feeling different. At first, space provides relief because it removes emotional intensity, but eventually the nervous system adapts. The silence becomes normal. The freedom becomes familiar. And once that adjustment occurs, a new question begins emerging beneath the surface. Now what? The avoidant can no longer attribute their emotional state to feeling overwhelmed because the source of that overwhelm is gone. They have the space they wanted. They have the independence they protected. They have the distance they believed would make everything easier. Yet something unexpected starts happening. The absence itself becomes noticeable. The good morning messages that once felt routine are no longer there. The conversations that filled quiet moments have disappeared. The emotional presence they often took for granted is suddenly missing. What once felt like liberation slowly transforms into awareness. Awareness that someone who occupied a meaningful place in their life is no longer part of their daily reality. This is usually not a dramatic realization. It unfolds gradually, quietly, almost invisibly, but it marks an important turning point, because this is the stage where the avoidant can no longer focus only on what they escaped. They begin confronting what they lost, and once that awareness appears, memories begin behaving differently. During the relationship, emotional closeness may have felt overwhelming. The avoidant's attention was often focused on pressure, vulnerability, uncertainty, or fear. Those experiences occupied so much psychological space that many positive moments faded into the background. But distance changes perspective. Without the immediate intensity of the relationship, the mind begins revisiting experiences through a different lens. Small moments start resurfacing unexpectedly. A conversation they forgot about, a laugh they did not fully appreciate at the time, a gesture of kindness they barely acknowledged when it happened. Memories that once seemed ordinary suddenly carry emotional weight. This is one reason nostalgia can become surprisingly powerful for avoidance. When emotional pressure disappears, appreciation often becomes easier. The mind starts editing together pieces of the relationship that were overlooked while defenses were active. And because these memories arrive without the same intensity that once triggered avoidance, they can feel unexpectedly comforting and unexpectedly painful. The avoidant may find themselves replaying moments they thought they had left behind, thinking about someone they expected to forget, missing things they never realized mattered so much. The distance that initially felt freeing begins creating opportunities for reflection, and reflection has a way of revealing emotional truths that distraction kept hidden. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the relationship starts transforming from something they escaped into something they remember, and for many avoidants, that is where the real emotional journey finally begins. And this is exactly why chasing an avoidant after they leave often creates the opposite effect of what people hope for. When the avoidant begins creating distance, the natural reaction for many people is to close that distance immediately. They send another message, they reach out again, they try to remind the avoidant of what they shared. They hope that enough love, enough patience, or enough persistence will bring the connection back. The intention is understandable. When you fear losing someone, every instinct tells you to move closer. But psychologically, this often interrupts the very process that would have forced the avoidant to confront the loss. As long as your presence remains easily accessible, the emotional consequences of your absence never fully arrive. The avoidant still receives pieces of the connection without having to experience what life actually feels like without it. They can continue avoiding difficult emotions because the relationship remains partially available in the background. This is why time becomes such an important factor. Not because time is magical, but because time creates reality. It removes shortcuts, it removes emotional escape routes, it creates a situation where the avoidant can no longer rely on your presence while simultaneously avoiding the vulnerability that comes with fully choosing you. For perhaps the first time, they are forced to sit with the actual consequences of distance, and consequences are powerful teachers. Many lessons that cannot be learned through conversation are learned through absence. Many emotions that cannot be accessed through pressure emerge naturally through loss. The harder someone works to prevent an avoidant from feeling that loss, the longer it often takes for emotional awareness to develop. As the weeks continue passing, another realization begins quietly unfolding beneath the surface. The avoidant starts discovering that independence and isolation are not the same thing. Throughout much of their life, they may have associated emotional self-sufficiency with strength. Needing less from others felt safer. Depending on no one felt safer. Maintaining distance felt safer. But safety and fulfillment are not always the same thing. During the early stages of separation, independence may feel empowering. There is freedom, there is control, there is space. Yet eventually a different experience starts emerging. The routines continue, work continues, responsibilities continue, life keeps moving, but certain emotional needs remain unmet. Human beings are wired for connection. No amount of independence completely removes that reality. The avoidant may not recognize it immediately, but the loneliness they once escaped through distance begins revealing itself in new ways. Moments that were once shared become solitary. Achievements feel quieter. Difficult days feel heavier. The absence of emotional intimacy starts creating an emptiness that practical distractions cannot fully replace. This realization can be deeply uncomfortable because it challenges a belief many avoidants have carried for years. the belief that needing connection is somehow dangerous. The longer they sit with genuine isolation, the harder it becomes to ignore the truth that emotional independence alone is not enough to create a meaningful life. And as this loneliness grows more visible, something else begins happening. The emotional debt they postponed starts demanding payment. Every feeling that was delayed, minimized, rationalized, or pushed aside begins resurfacing. This is one of the least understood aspects of emotional avoidance. Avoidance is not elimination, it is postponement. The emotions do not disappear. They accumulate, they wait, they gather strength in the background. Then one day they return, often all at once. The avoidant starts remembering conversations they never fully processed. They start recognizing feelings they never allowed themselves to feel. Regret begins appearing in places where certainty once existed. Questions begin surfacing where confidence once lived. The emotional cost of distance becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. What makes this process so challenging is that it often arrives when the avoidant least expects it. They believed they had moved on. They believed the difficult part was behind them. Then suddenly memories feel heavier, the silence feels louder, the absence feels more permanent. And with that realization comes an uncomfortable awareness. Emotional consequences have finally caught up, not because time created new feelings, but because time removed enough distractions for old feelings to become impossible to avoid. This is where time becomes the one thing the avoidant cannot control. Throughout much of their life, distance has functioned as a form of emotional management. If intimacy feels overwhelming, create space. If vulnerability feels uncomfortable, withdraw. If emotions become too intense, focus elsewhere. These strategies often provide short-term relief because they create the illusion of control, but time slowly weakens that illusion. The avoidant can control physical distance, they can control communication, they can control access. What they cannot control forever is the gradual unfolding of emotional truth. Every day creates more opportunities for reflection. Every week adds perspective. Every month reveals details that were invisible before. The relationship begins existing not as a source of pressure but as a memory, and memories are often processed differently than experiences happening in real time. The defenses that once felt necessary begin losing some of their urgency. Without the immediate fear of vulnerability dominating awareness, appreciation becomes easier, loss becomes clearer, meaning becomes more visible. The avoidant discovers something frustrating. Distance solved the problem of emotional overwhelm, but it did not solve the problem of emotional attachment. The feelings they thought space would eliminate are still there, waiting beneath the surface, growing harder to deny with each passing season. Eventually, there comes a day when even distraction starts losing its effectiveness. At first, distractions work remarkably well. There are projects to complete, goals to pursue, friends to see, responsibilities to manage. Every occupied moment creates another opportunity to avoid sitting alone with unresolved emotions. But distractions are temporary by nature. They fill time, not emotional voids. The avoidant may spend months convincing themselves they are doing fine because life appears functional from the outside. They are productive, they are busy, they are moving forward. Yet beneath all that movement, something remains unfinished. Then a quiet evening arrives. A familiar song plays unexpectedly. A memory surfaces without warning. A place, a date, a scent, or a random thought opens a door they believed was closed. Suddenly the distractions stop working, not because they disappear, but because the emotions have become strong enough to exist alongside them. This is often the moment the avoidant begins realizing that what they are feeling is not merely boredom, loneliness, or nostalgia. It is grief. It is attachment. It is the recognition that someone who once occupied an important place in their emotional world is truly gone. And unlike the relief they felt at the beginning, this realization cannot be escaped through busyness, because once emotional truth finally arrives, it demands to be felt. And for many avoidants, that is when the real pain begins, not at the moment of separation, but long after everyone assumed they had already moved on. And once that pain finally arrives, an important distinction begins revealing itself. Missing someone is not the same thing as missing attention. Many people assume that if an avoidant starts thinking about an X months later, it must simply be loneliness talking. They imagine the avoidant is bored, seeking comfort, or craving validation, and sometimes that can happen. Human beings naturally miss companionship when they spend enough time alone, but genuine emotional longing is different. It has a different texture, it reaches deeper. Missing attention is often focused on what someone provided. Missing a person is focused on who they were. The avoidant begins remembering specific qualities that cannot be replaced by just anyone, a particular way of understanding them, a certain laugh, a certain presence, a specific emotional connection that felt unique. This is when the loss starts becoming personal rather than abstract. They are no longer simply reacting to the absence of companionship, they are confronting the absence of someone who occupied a distinct place in their emotional world. And that realization can be surprisingly painful because it forces them to acknowledge something they may have spent months avoiding. Not all connections are interchangeable. Some people leave an imprint that cannot be replicated through distractions, casual interactions, or the passage of time. The avoidant begins understanding that what is missing is not merely attention, it is a person. As this awareness deepens, something fascinating starts happening inside their mind. They begin revising the story they once told themselves about the relationship. During periods of emotional overwhelm, avoidants often focus heavily on what felt difficult. The pressure, the expectations, the vulnerability, the fears. These aspects dominate awareness because they activate the nervous system's need for self-protection. But distance changes perspective. Without the emotional intensity of the relationship occurring in real time, the avoidant gains access to a broader view. They start seeing details they previously overlooked. Moments of support suddenly stand out. Acts of patience become more visible. Efforts they once took for granted begin carrying greater significance. This does not mean they rewrite history into a fantasy. Rather, they begin seeing the relationship more completely. The protective filters that emphasize discomfort start weakening. Appreciation becomes easier, nuance becomes clearer. They recognize strengths they minimized and contributions they failed to fully value. The relationship transforms from a source of pressure into a source of perspective. And perspective has a way of exposing truths that are difficult to see while emotionally overwhelmed. The avoidant may find themselves thinking, I didn't fully understand what I had when it was right in front of me. That realization can be incredibly humbling because it forces them to confront the gap between what they felt in the moment and what they understand now. This is often where regret quietly enters the picture. Not the dramatic regret people imagine in movies, not some sudden emotional collapse. Real regret tends to arrive gradually. It appears in small realizations, small memories, small moments of clarity. The avoidant begins recognizing opportunities they never took, conversations they never finished, feelings they never expressed, chances they assumed would always remain available. One of the most painful aspects of regret is that it depends on hindsight. You only understand certain losses after enough time has passed to reveal their significance. While the relationship existed, the avoidant may have believed distance would solve everything. They may have assumed that once space was created, certainty would return. Yet as months pass, a different truth begins emerging. The relationship did not fail because there was no connection. It failed because connection collided with fear. And now the fear that once felt necessary starts looking different. The walls that once seemed protective begin resembling barriers. The withdrawal that once felt justified begins appearing costly. Regret often grows in the space between what happened and what could have happened. The avoidant starts imagining alternate versions of the story. What if they had stayed present longer? What if they had communicated differently? What if they had been brave enough to tolerate vulnerability instead of escaping it? These questions rarely arrive all at once. They emerge slowly, growing heavier with time. But while all of this may be unfolding inside the avoidant, there is another side of the story that deserves attention: the person left behind. Because one of the greatest mistakes people make after separation is putting their life on hold while waiting for the avoidant to reach these realizations. They tell themselves that if they wait long enough, the avoidant will eventually understand. If they remain available, the avoidant will eventually